Good evening, and welcome to Beckman Auditorium, to Caltech, and to a very special Behind the Book. Special for a number of reasons, one of which was that so many of you RSVP'd, or so many of you were told you can't RSVP anymore until we changed venues from Ramo to Beckman so that we could accommodate all of the interested people. So we're thrilled that you're here, and we are all in for a very, very interesting evening. I'm Michael Alexander. I am the Caltech Arts and Culture Liaison and have worked on some performing arts programs that we've done here. I've worked on a series called Movies That Matter, and I'll talk about one of those coming up. And Behind the Book. Both Movies That Matter and Behind the Book were created as a way of providing services during the pandemic, and they proved successful enough that we've continued them and bring them inside of the halls now instead of having to have people watch them online. This evening's program is being recorded, so you can tell your friends that in about a week's time, the Caltech YouTube site will be carrying this. They just have to look at Caltech and Behind the Book, and then they'll find this along with the many others that we have. Just a quick reminder, and I have to remember this myself, it's make sure your phone is on silent. And at the back of the hall, you can see the exit signs. If there's, for some reason, a reason that we can't go out the back, you can gather here on stage. Our staff will help guide you out of the building. Have yet to have an issue where we have to deal with that. I particularly want to start by saying, first off, we had an interesting week here at Caltech last week. The Student Affairs Office is now created as Student Affairs and Support Network. And last week we were talking about supporting those students interested in various types of spiritual needs that they may have here on campus. So it was just coincidental that it was happening just a week before tonight's talk. And hopefully some of the students, because I got a chance to talk to colleagues that we were having this talk, and hopefully some of them went back and told even some of the students that they directly work with, and we'll see. I'm just curious, how many people are here on campus for the very first time? Great, there's a few of you. Well, we have a whole slew of series that we do, and I will come into and announce those in a moment, but I do want to start off here by saying that I'm particularly grateful to Professor Emeritus Mark Davis. He was able to arrange and actually make a personal contribution to support this evening's program, and it is honoring his late wife, Mary P. Davis, who was a scientist and an engineer and was a very active member of the First Methodist Church here in Pasadena. So I'd like to ask us all to just give him a hand and thank him for his support. We also get some support for many of our programs from the Caltech Employees Federal Credit Union. You can all sign up to be on our emailing list, and we'll only send you one email a month. We have a monthly newsletter, comes out at the beginning of the month. If you go to Caltech, events.caltech.edu, you'll be able to get very quickly to the part of our website where you can sign up and get our mailers. Among the upcoming events we have is that the Caltech's Chamber Orchestra is going to be performing on Saturday, the 30th. No, yes, 30th, yes. No, it's 31st, 30th is, pardon?
31st is a Saturday.
All right, then they're on Friday the 30th. Thank you. This is the interactive part of the program. Okay, good. And they're going to be in Dabney Auditorium at 8 o'clock, and it's a free performance. We have Professor Kimberly C. from our chemistry department, part of our Watson series on February 25th, and she is, her topic is Chasing Sustainable Chemistries for the Future. And I think you've seen notices about that. These Watsons also tend to max out on the number of people registering, so I would advise you to register early. Katie Bowman is going to be here in March on the 25th, and she is going to talk on how AI and physics work together to discover more about the hidden universe. She is the face of the first photograph of a black hole. You probably saw this young lady with her look on her face that made newspapers all over the place. We were very proud to get her to come to Caltech just after that photo was taken, because I can't remember which university she was at, but now she's here working at Caltech. During Earth Week in April, we have two programs that we're doing. On the 22nd of April, as part of our Movies That Matter series, we have a film called Bioscape, and it's how they're using remote censoring to look at what is happening, and it was particularly focusing on South Africa for the purposes of this study. But they're looking at the impact of invasive plants and invasive animals. You know, we love our eucalyptus trees here, but they don't belong here. And the same as in South Africa with other plants that are being brought there. And this movie is going to be looking at the consequences of that. And we're looking to have a very interesting panel and Q&A following that. And then on the Friday night, we're working with the Colburn School's Baroque Orchestra. And they're going to be doing a concert devoted to climate change. Possibly the most well-recognized voice on this campus is Lucy Jones. Dr. Lucy Jones is the seismologist that radio stations and TV stations all over the country go to every time there's a little bit of earth shaking. But she happens to be a Baroque music specialist. She plays the viola da gamba, and she composed a piece of music that has a drone note that starts very low, representing the average Earth temperature in 1880, and that drone note keeps rising as the Earth's temperature, and it's going to be part of this program. It's a free concert, as is the Movies That Matter, and that's taking place here on the Friday, April 24th. We will ask you to register for those as well. Caltech is also the home of the Coleman Chamber Music Series, and you can look them up and find out about how to find out about their upcoming performances. We've made a slight change for the Q&A tonight. You're going to see information about a Slido, but instead of the Slido, the speakers would prefer that we just use cards. So some of you picked them up already. Our two student staff people here are going to be walking the aisles after the talk at appropriate times. Just raise your hand and they'll give you a card, they'll give you a pencil, and when you're finished with the card, just wave it up and they'll grab it and bring it back up here onto the stage so that the speakers can address any questions that you have. We also have books for sale. We're working with Vromans, and there's a lot more people than there are books. So if they run out of books, they have a QR code that you can go to so you can secure a book for yourself. Professor Emeritus Mark Davis joined Caltech in the Chemical Engineering Division in 1991. He is one of a very small group of people elected to all of the United States National Academies: sciences, engineering, medicine, and inventors. He's the first Caltecher to receive the Prince Asturias Award for technical and scientific research given to him by the King of Spain. He, like our author, has of late been studying the interface between science and religion, and I'm going to let him do the introduction of our visitor from near Newcastle, England, our main speaker tonight, Dr. Reverend David Wilkinson. So let's give a welcome to the two gentlemen, Professor Mark Davis, the Dr. Reverend David Wilkinson.
Good evening, everyone. It's really great to see this many people interested in this topic. You know, we had to move it from Ramo, as you heard, because it just wasn't enough room. So it's my pleasure to bring Reverend Dr. David Wilkinson to Caltech this week. We've had a great week interacting with students, faculty, etc. David is the professor in the Department of Theology and Religion and the director of a program called Equipping Christian Leadership in an Age of Science program, both at Durham University in the UK. He's well known throughout the world for his work on the interface between these two, science and religion. And David has a very unusual background. He started off in his first PhD was in astrophysics. And the title of his thesis was Molecular Hydrogen in Galaxies. And he doesn't know this, but David and I have a commonality from our graduate work. David worked on hydrogen for star formation in galaxies. I worked on making hydrogen from water so that we could have hydrogen here on Earth. Yes. So mine is a little bit more mundane than his work. But after finishing his PhD in astrophysics, he went on and got a second PhD in theology. So David is currently a fellow of the Royal Astronomy Society, or Astronomical Society. And interestingly, he's a regular contributor to BBC Radio 4's Thought for the Day, where something that's interesting in the science realm, he gets notified maybe the day before, even sometimes the morning. Can you talk about it for 2 minutes and 45 seconds, that precise? And it's to try to explain to the audience what this means and then how does it relate to theology. And he's actually done some of these on work here at Caltech and JPL. So as we were meeting with the students this week, we were joking, do some really good work and he'll talk about it. So he's published, as I said, very extensively in this interface area. And I've read many of his books. And so I selected two for us to begin the conversation tonight. So what we're going to do is we're going to begin the conversation on these two books, and then we'll open up for questions. We have some of the cards already, and you can bring up the card, or we'll have people collect the cards. But I really would like to have it be a true conversation between you and David. So the two books that I selected, you've seen in the advertisement, and what I'd like to begin with is this one. The title of this book is God, Stephen Hawking, and the Multiverse. And so, David, what is it that what are the messages that you want to convey to your reader in this book?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and Mark. Lovely to be in conversation with you first. Two messages, really, from this book. The first is that Professor Hawking's work is fascinating from a scientific point of view. And I became interested in it originally as a young research student because there was and continues to be a problem with our ability to explain the whole story of the universe. Physics, as many of you know here, is extremely successful. It can tell us what the universe was like when it was only 1 million years old. Our current age, by the way, is 13.8 billion years. Some of us feel it more than others at times. We know what the universe was like, we think, using our current laws of physics, right back to 1 second old. And if that isn't sufficient, many believe right back to 10 to the minus 43 of a second. That's 1 divided by 10 followed by 42 zeroths of a second. If you're a biologist or an engineer or a normal person, if you know what I mean, you'll say that's basically zero, isn't it? But no, it's not. At that point, our laws of physics break down. And that's because general relativity and quantum theory don't fit together. That's why Professor Hawking, and this is what intrigued me first of all, pursued a quantum theory of gravity to fill in that first 10 to the minus 43 of a second. And that's a continuing story for both theorists and observationalists in trying to take science back to the very beginning. And that links me to my second point, which is that the religious believer shouldn't be afraid of that. That's a fascinating story, first of all, to explore all of the physics in that. But the religious believer shouldn't be afraid of that quest, because sometimes religious believers use inadequate arguments for God. And when I was a young student, I used an inadequate argument for God. It went something like this, and you've probably heard it in a restaurant or a pub. It goes like this. If the universe began with a big bang, then who lit the explosion? Who set it all off? Or to put it another way, if our laws of physics break down at 10 to the minus 43 of a second, isn't that where we need to insert God? The trouble with that, for me, is that it's what Charles Coulson, a great mathematician, called a God of the gaps argument. Beware, said Coulson, if science has a gap in it, of inserting God into the gap as the explanation. Because increasingly, as science explains more and more of its own area, God is pushed out of the gap. And so, originally the book was just about God, the Big Bang, and Stephen Hawking. And it said, first of all, this is really interesting science. Isn't it cool? Isn't it provisional? Let's explore it. The second message is, if you're a religious believer, don't be worried if those who follow Professor Hawking in this quest fill in that first 10 to the minus 43 of a second, because that simply tells us more of God's story. Kepler, the great astronomer, once said that science is thinking God's thoughts after him. And I love that sense of discovery, of journeying, of understanding the universe. And I don't think that God puts limits on that. So really interesting science. And if you're a religious believer, don't see it as a threat. Two messages, I think, of the book.
Okay. So do you want to explain what the concept of the multiverse is?
Well, I'd love to if I really fully understood it, as many of us know. Now, multiverse is very sexy at the moment, both in science and cosmology and in science fiction, of course. And there are many different theories of multiverse. One is that our universe is a little bubble universe amongst many. You know, if you take a washing up liquid and pour on water, you get a foam of bubbles. Well, maybe the universe started as a little bubble which then began to expand in a Big Bang expansion. And ours expanded because the laws of physics within that bubble were just right. And so we may be one of many. And then there were those who talked about many universes in terms of whether the universe expanded and there was enough mass in it, so it then started to contract into the opposite of a Big Bang, a big crunch. And in the 80s, we used to think about whether the universe would then bounce and expand and contract. And we're increasingly skeptical of that because of the discoveries at the end of the 1990s around the accelerating universe, that the universe will expand forever. And then there's another multiverse theory. I don't know whether you want me to go into this detail or not. It's late on a Friday night, but there's another multiverse theory, which is a particular interpretation of quantum mechanics from Hugh Everett III, who said that in every quantum event, the universe bifurcates, splits, and bringing about billions of different universes, all slightly different. So in one universe, Mark, you and I are having this conversation just as a pink elephant comes through the room. Now, all of those theories are interesting. Some of them are supported by some of the interpretations of the early universe and inflationary theory and other things. I think they're important because they remind us that we can't use a certain argument for the existence of God. And I'll come back to that again in a moment. Okay. But the philosophical standing of other universes is really important because at the moment, it's difficult to see how you can pass information from one universe to the other. And if we can't pass information from one universe to the other, does that bring it under the realm of science or not? And that's where there's a great deal of controversy and conversation. Now, if I may apply then multiverse, I think it's important for this reason. You've probably heard of anthropic balances, what Paul Davies talks about as the Goldilocks enigma. The fact that the laws and circumstances of the universe in many ways are just right for the possibility of life. And I think that's a really interesting observation. It's a non-trivial fact about the universe. that the law and circumstance of the universe is just right to bring about human beings. But Multiverse says, hold on a moment. It may be that we just observe that because we're in the universe where we're observing it. In other universes where the laws of physics are different, maybe there are no observers to see. And the importance of that for me is just to be hesitant, again about fellow religious believers who say, I'm going to try and prove the existence of God through these anthropic balances, because God is the only explanation of these balances. Multiverse comes along and says, just be careful a moment. And so for me, these anthropic balances are significant. They may be a pointer towards a deeper story to the universe. But Multiverse just cautions me. Now, a number of people say to me, as a Christian believer, are you worried about many universes? To which my answer is emphatically no. I mean, we live in a universe already which has 100 billion stars in each of 100 billion galaxies. That's a lot of stars. A few more universes is not a great theological problem to a God who's created already 100 billion stars and 100 billion galaxies. And so in that sense, it's fun. Is it philosophy? Is it physics? We'll see. But it's not a problem for the person who believes in God.
Great. But I think that when you think about the multiverse, it just pushes the problem back one other level, right? If you only have one universe, there still has to be a beginning. If you have multi-universes, there has to be a beginning for many of them now, right?
That's right. And we need to be careful about beginning because both of those things we've talked about, Mark, as you know, link together. But underneath that sense of Professor Hawkins' work on the very first moment of the universe, and underneath the sense of multiverse, and of course, those of you who've read Professor Hawkins through his book, The Grand Design, will know that he combines these two together. Both of them assume something very important, which is the physical laws. The laws of nature that many people in this place use because they are universal, and they're faithful, and they're intelligible to us. Now, science assumes the physical laws. It doesn't explain where they come from. Mm-hmm. And so if Professor Hawkins says that the universe comes through a quantum fluctuation, I think it's reasonable for the philosopher, for the theologian, for the faith believer to say, but with respect, where does quantum theory itself come from? And why are these laws intelligible to us? Albert Einstein once said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. Mm-hmm. You've just got to think about that for a moment. Why is it that we're here on a Friday evening talking about the universe back to 10 to the minus 43 of a second? And it's well, I hope it's intelligible a little bit to us.
I would say it's fun.
It's fun. And so where do the laws of physics themselves come from? For me, is a metaphysical question. And for the person who believes that this universe is created, then a God who is the faithful sustainer of the laws of physics has coherence to it as an explanation. Can't prove God, but it coheres with the nature of the universe that we see.
All right, thank you, David. So I know you've spent some time thinking and studying about possibilities for the end of the universe.
Yes.
So you just mentioned it's vast, huge amount of numbers. Why? No one knows. But what's the interest in trying to understand how this might progress to people that are here who are not going to be around when any of this happens?
Well, that's right. And so, I mean, you begin with the end of the sun. The sun will eventually run out of hydrogen fuel, will begin to swell up. The Earth will be crispified in the outer layers of the sun. But the accelerating universe, and there's some interesting science involved in all of this at the moment, of whether it's accelerating with a constant kind of acceleration, or whether there may be something different in the future. But a universe that accelerates and gets bigger, people say, well, we're going to be around for a long time as a universe. Mm-hmm. The trouble is that as the universe expands, it gets colder, and stars turn into black holes, and the universe becomes a rather depressing, lifeless place. Now, as you rightly say, Mark, we're talking 20 billion years or so before that happens. So we're all right for breakfast in the morning. That's fine. But the end of the story is very important in understanding the nature of a story. I mean, you don't read a murder mystery and say, I've got 3/4 of the way through. It's been a nice story so far. I'm not going to read any more. The end of the narrative is important. Now, there are a number of scientists, such as Paul Davies, who find the concept of a cold, lifeless universe immensely depressing, to use his word. I think for the person who believes in creation, the question is, what are the purposes of God with this creation? Now, some Christian believers say, well, God's not interested in the physical stuff of the universe. God's only interested in souls and spirits. I don't see that in the God of the Bible. And in fact, what's interesting to me as a theologian is that the Bible itself talks about the futility of this creation, but God's purpose of transforming this creation into a new heaven and a new earth. Not just a kind of grayish heaven up there, but a whole transformation of this creation. And so I think in the face of a future futility that science predicts in terms of the universe itself, the Christian hope is of a God who transforms the physical stuff of the universe into a new heaven and new earth. And a number of people at this point immediately stop me and say, oh, come on, that's all that. Isn't that just pie in the sky when you die and all the rest of it? But the central message of the New Testament is that that transformation is both evidenced by and modeled in the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's the importance of the bodily resurrection for Christians, because God actually does something with the stuff of the universe. Now, the fact that God works with the stuff of the universe is really important to me as a physicist, because that's an affirmation of physics and chemical engineering and other odd subjects that come along as well. Yeah.
Great. So this will be off a little bit, but one person I admired a lot was this producer, Gene Roddenberry.
Yes.
So some of you may know that he was the person who came up with Star Trek. And the reason is if you look back at the original series, human progression through the universe always put humans in a positive light. And that's what I liked so much about that, you know, it was we solved the problems we had to, so Earth survived. And as we propagated through the universe, we, of course, ran into all kinds of different characters, but the human perspective on this was always in a very positive, move forward kind of light. Have people in the, philosophical community ever discussed? I thought it was really quite nice, because a lot of fiction, movies, and so forth always painted a negative future. And this one I always admired because it painted a very positive future.
You're right, and many science fiction writers talk about a future which actually is very bleak. Roddenberry had this view that science and technology, coupled with the human spirit, would mean growth and development. And indeed, on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, different backgrounds, races, languages all came together in common humanity. One or two problems with Klingons here and there, but apart from that, things were pretty much all right. Now, the only hesitation about Roddenberry, and a number of us have engaged with science fiction from the theology community, is that Roddenberry at times strayed from that celebration of that which is human in terms of love and sacrifice into what Richard Bauckham and Trevor Hart a number of years ago called the myth of human progress. What they meant by that was that if you take that too far, you say that science, technology, and education can lead to utopia, or, to push it further, inevitably lead to utopia. And the difficulty with that is the Christian recognition that human beings are beautiful and creative, and yet at the same time somehow broken. Theologically, theologians talk about sin as that brokenness, selfishness within us. And so human education, science, technology can do wonderful things. And my friend, you've done wonderful things in science and technology, in terms of healing, in terms of safety, a whole number of things. But we can never achieve utopia, says the Christian, without God being at the center of that human community. And Roddenberry was very skeptical about God. He didn't like God in his narrative. And when Rick Berman and others took over the franchise of Star Trek, if you're a Trekkie, by the way, any Trekkies here, you'll know that Star Trek and Next Generation had very, very few references to religion or spirituality. But as you move through in Deep Space Nine and Voyager, you began to see spirituality beginning to appear more and more. And I think there's something important about that actually the God who is the Lord of the universe goes with us into space. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm going to move forward to the next book now because I want to give time for questions here later tonight. So the second book I picked that we would discuss for a few minutes is titled Science, Religion, and the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. I'm going to cross out intelligence and let's just say life.
Yeah.
Okay? So again, David, I'm going to start off with the question, what were you trying to convey in this book? And, you wrote this over 10 years ago.
I did.
And so many things have happened since that time. Would you ever consider updating it? And if so, what were the things that really impressed you since the time you wrote the book?
I certainly, at the rate of scientific progress, I think I need to update the book every 6 months at the moment. So I began to write it on the cusp or the back of the new discoveries of exoplanets, which has transformed a great deal of the discourse. And much of the work, of course, has been done here. And now we know of over 6,000 exoplanets, planets beyond our own solar system, of which about 220 are terrestrial, small rocky planets. And I think that's the thing that's changed with and the whole movement into telescopes and probes developed in and around here, which allow us to find exoplanets and begin to sense atmospheres, look at the atmospheres to look at signatures for life. And that's an evolving field. But some of the big arguments, I think, stay the same, and I'll give you a few of them. Mm-hmm. The first is to be cautious of the argument that goes, well, we've got 6,000 exoplanets, and therefore we know that most stars will have planets, and a proportion of those, a good proportion, might be terrestrial planets. You know what people say next? You've got 100 billion stars and 100 billion galaxies. Well, therefore, there must be other life and intelligent life out there. And part of the book is saying, really exciting, really interesting science, but be cautious of that argument for two reasons. The first is that you could have lots of life, but it may not be intelligent life. To put it bluntly, it's a long way from an amoeba to an accountant. Or well, anyway, that's for you to decide. You could have lots of primitive life, but actually the evolutionary development into self-conscious, intelligent life, and we're still struggling to know what consciousness is a long road. So there could be lots of primitive life. By the way, that doesn't make Star Trek very interesting. To boldly go to seek out more amoebas and even more bacteria is not quite the... So there's that. The second caution about that argument, there must be life out there, comes from Enrico Fermi, one of the great physicists.
I was just going to bring that up.
Yeah, so let's talk about Fermi for a moment. So
Okay.
Fermi is having lunch with some friends, and they're joking about cartoons that were around, because there were two news stories around at the time. One was people seeing flying saucers, and the second was the disappearance of trash cans in New York City. And in a famous cartoon in the New Yorker, there's a cartoon of the aliens taking the trash cans away to their flying saucer. Fermi's having some conversation with his friends, and then he goes into one of his silences. And Fermi went into silence because he was working something out in his head. And they sat at lunch, and they were having lunch, and Fermi looked up and said, "Where is everybody?" Now, what he meant by that was not how many people were in the restaurant, but he thought to himself, if I have an intelligent civilization who sends out a probe or a couple of probes to other star systems, they then self-replicate by using the resources that are there, and they start to send out probes. How long would it take to colonize the galaxy? And we can do that, and actually we can check it against the way that human colonization has happened, and it turns out to be something of the order of 300 million years or so. For a civilization to colonize 100 billion stars in our galaxy. That sounds a very long time, but compared to the fact that the galaxies have been around for 10 billion years, it's a very short time. So Fermi's point was that if life was easily evolving into intelligent life, we should have seen it already. Where is everybody? Now, Fermi's friend Leo Szilard, a Hungarian physicist, responded to Fermi's, if they existed, they would be here, by saying they are here, and they're called Hungarians. That was Szillard's response to it. So the first part of the book is to say, let's just be careful with these arguments. The second part of the book, I think, is to try and tell a story that many distinguished historians have told, but actually hasn't got out a great deal. And that is that the first people to speculate about other worlds were Christian theologians. Let me just say that again. The first people to speculate about other worlds were Christian theologians. And if you go back to Basil and Origen and a number of other church fathers, you find them using this argument. They said, if God is the sovereign creator who's free to create however God wants to create, who are we to say that he hasn't created other worlds? And then a famous theologian called Nicholas of Cusa coupled that with a very important argument a few centuries later. And Cusa said, the thing that makes us special as human beings is not that we are alone in the universe or the center of the universe. The thing that makes us special as human beings is relationship. The gift of relationship given to human beings by God. And therefore, it doesn't matter where you are or whether you're alone, you are special because you're loved by God. So when we sit down as a family back in England, in order to feel special, I don't need to be the only one at the table. Nor do I have to sit at the head of the table to feel special. I feel special because I am loved. And the importance of that is that some Christians get worried about extraterrestrial intelligence because they think, well, human beings aren't special if there's other beings out there. These church fathers and distinguished theologians of the church said, don't worry about that. God's big enough for all of that.
Right.
God can create in whatever ways God creates. And if there are others, whether it be bacteria or intelligent little green women and little green men, then don't worry about it, because the God that we see in Jesus says that we're special.
Great. So if you ever see this story about Fermi, this is now called the Fermi paradox. So you might see that written in the literature. That's how it's described, what David's story was. And it's a famous quote now. So let's pursue a few more things about life. Talk about Darwin.
Yes.
Okay. So I'd like to hear how Darwin and his, some of his findings and what he said fits into this whole picture.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to drop you back even further about the first elements of how life, okay?
At which point I'll turn the question around to you and we can talk together on that. I mean, I think Darwin is interesting at this point for a whole number of reasons. I think in terms of the development of life, Darwinian evolution, you can interpret it in different ways. Stephen Jay Gould said, once you start the evolutionary process, you always end up at a different place. Simon Conway Morris at Cambridge has argued against that and talked about evolutionary convergences. He says in the evolutionary picture, this randomness nevertheless has certain convergences. So the eye appears a number of times independently in the evolutionary tree. And Simon's work means that we could say that if you had different life developing, evolving, it might be that a humanoid embodiment of intelligence is an evolutionary convergence. And so rather than James T. Kirk saying it's life but not as we know it, Spock, actually there could be some similarity to the nature of life. But Darwin himself was an interesting person and at the heart of a lot of debates around science and religion. Darwin, started off thinking about being a doctor, but didn't really could cope with the sight of blood. And he did what everyone who drops out of medical school does. He went to become a church leader, a clergyman. He didn't get into that either because he started to talk with the botanists and geologists at Cambridge and became fascinated by this. He then, on the basis of observations in the Galapagos Islands and his experience of fossil beds and earthquakes in South America, came to this view of evolution. But his religious faith, and I find this most moving, his religious faith was not eroded by the science. As Nick Spencer has argued, his religious faith came down to the fact that his beloved daughter Annie, at the age of 10, became ill. Darwin prayed, took her to Malvern, to the waters there that supposedly had healing power, and she died. It was at her death that Nick Spencer argues that Darwin's religious faith evaporated at that point. And I think for all of us, our personal story and our scientific understanding are always intertwined. They're always there together. The other interesting thing about Darwin is the myth that Darwin was rejected by Christians here, there, and everywhere. In fact, the Christian church had a mixed reaction to Darwin. Asa Gray, the Harvard paleontologist, Charles Kingsley, author of The Water Babies, were great advocates and supporters of Darwin. Many, and sorry for the sexism, but this was the case in the 19th century, over 700 gentlemen of science, as they were called in the UK, post-Darwin, wrote a letter in which they said, we're quite relaxed about Darwin. A number of Christians objected, of course. Sorry, I'm getting off the point, Mark.
No,
Bring
that's
me
okay.
back to where you want me to be.
Well, I think, you've said what I wanted you to say, hear you say, the story about Darwin and the fact that there wasn't really this major separation that a lot of people think
That's
happened.
right.
So let me drop you back a little bit even further, because today, as we know, people are always talking about, the molecules that we're finding on asteroids now. So there's the discussion of, now we see several different types of amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, or that are building the blocks of us. To me, things are so complex, I still can't see this happening spontaneously. The molecules, people talk about, could there be life based on silicon rather than carbon? I've worked with silicon chemistry, I've worked with carbon chemistry. I personally don't believe that.
Sure.
But I've seen enough about how difficult it is to make very complex systems self-assemble to, do very precise function. And one of the things that we have in our body is that these molecules have a left hand and a right hand. And all of the proteins and amino acids, except for one amino acid, are left-handed. And all the sugars in your body are right-handed. Why? And so to me, there seems to be some, I don't know whether we'll ever understand it, but, when you think about how life evolved, and then, some of the other things you might mention, what the Cambrian explosion is and how does that play into it. Where does this all fit in from, your side as far as being both a scientist and a theologian?
Thank you. And in one sense, I need to defer on some of these questions to, I'm just a mere astrophysicist. I don't understand a huge amount about this in the way that you do. But hearing you speak, for me, a number of things come out of it. The first is that, isn't this an amazing, complex process and world, first of all? But secondly, that in order to have creation, you have to have both law and freedom. And in fact, both of them need to go together. The law and circumstance of the universe, as Paul Davies would say. Now, Paul actually believes that some of these things are because written into the very laws of physics are the possibilities for these things to happen. We're back to, where do the laws come from? And this particular understanding that there is something very special about this universe. Remember, I said I don't believe that there is a proof of God in this. But I do think that they are pointers towards a deeper story to the universe. So you and I can sit here and we can go, isn't this amazing? Now, what we then could do is take different interpretations of it. One of my favorite friends, cosmologists, is Sir Lord Martin Rees, former Astronomer Royal in the UK. And Martin wrote a book a number of years ago called Just Six Numbers. He says, if these numbers aren't just right, you can't have life. And then he said, my friends, you've got three possibilities in response. You could say, well, all of this is just very interesting, but to be honest, I'm not really interested, so I'm going away to watch another episode of The Simpsons or Star Trek. Mm-hmm. And Lord Rees says, no scientist can really say that, because some of these things are so extraordinary, you just can't ignore them. So that leaves him with two possibilities. One is multiverse, which we've talked about. The second is, he says, this is creation. Now, Lord Rees goes for multiverse. I go for creation as the most compelling answer to that. But I want to just be clear about this, that is part of more arguments and more insights into the world that are important for me. I'm not led to Christianity because of these scientific arguments. I was led to Christianity because I encountered Jesus Christ, both in history and in present experience. Now, that gave me a framework by which I can find that these scientific arguments go here together. And it's from that framework that, for me, that's the most compelling interpretation. That means that I come not to prove God to people, but to suggest that from the framework of seeing a God who becomes a human being in Jesus Christ, some of these scientific insights cohere with that interpretation.
Great. So I'm going to start now with taking questions that have been turned in from the audience. And as you have more, Camilla, can you pick those up? And we'll get on them. And please, I apologize for if I stumble on these questions because they're handwritten and some of them are going to be hard for me to read, okay? So while they're doing this, I'm going to start with this question here, which is, black dark matter is about 90% of all stuff. Is the spiritual realm there? Could it be that dark matter interacts with the physical world in ways such as demons, angels, etc.?
Wow, thank you, Mark. What a great question to start off, and thank you, whoever. One or two comments on that. The first is quite right to recognize that some 95% of the universe is made up of dark matter and dark energy. Around about 65 to 70% dark energy and 20 or 25%, whatever, I can't do my maths, dark matter. Now, first of all, it's important for me, therefore, to say that we don't know at the moment definitively what the dark matter is, and we certainly don't know what the dark energy is. We call them dark matter and dark energy because we don't know what they are, which means I sit before you talking about science, cosmology, astrophysics, knowing only what 5% of the universe is made of. You might say, he's got a cheek coming all the way from England, talking to us about the universe, and he only knows what 5% of the universe is actually made of. But at least I know that we only know what 5% of the universe is made of. I think for me that's, first of all, a question about the provisionality of science, that actually there are still big questions that we're pursuing. Now, the interaction of dark matter we know because it interacts gravitationally with galaxies and stars. Dark energy is a much more difficult thing to understand. And we know that it interacts, but I've never thought about it in terms of how these things interact in the spiritual realm. I think the first thing I want to say is that for me, if God is the God of creation, he's the Lord of not just the visible matter, but the dark matter and the dark energy. God is God of all. And if you're interested in this, you'll know that within Hebrew scriptures, there was often the location of that which is evil within the deep, the sea. You get that worked through also in Revelation later on. So people have always struggled with that which is unknown. But in all of that, the Hebrew Christian Bibles are full of God being Lord and creator of all things. I'm not sure what I think about angels and demons.
Okay.
I've had experiences in life and in pastoral ministry which go beyond some of the normal ways of explaining things. and I'm open to the possibility of that which goes beyond our normal laws of the universe. But that's a question I'll have to think more about. I'm sorry that that's not a really compelling or sharp answer to the question, but some of these things I've not thought about before. Well, thank you.
Great. Okay, you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. This question is, the director of the Vatican Observatory said that God is the force that arranged the universe. The Bible says that God sent us his only child. How can these two statements be reconciled? What's your take on that?
Yeah, thank you for the question again. And the director of the Vatican Observatory, who I know well, is someone who believes in both of those statements. I think there is a sense in which we're talking about a God who creates the whole universe and a God who seems to do particular things. And that's often been a difficulty. It's called in Christian theology the problem of particularity. The Christian revelation suggests that God communicates through a particular man in a particular place at a particular time in a particular way, Jesus. Why God chose to do that, I have no idea. But I'm convinced by looking at the history that Jesus can only be understood by this was God himself walking the pages of history. And there is something, I think, really important about this particularity. A number of years ago, a very good science communicator and professor of physics, John Taylor, wrote a book called Black Holes. In it, he talked beautifully about black holes, but he also had his argument why he didn't believe in God. And his argument against the existence of God went like this. He said, the universe is pretty big. Any God who created it must be infinite. Our minds are finite. Probably think that tonight, by the way. Our minds are finite. Professor Taylor then went on to say, how can a finite mind ever understand an infinite God? Therefore, we can't understand an infinite God. We may as well say God doesn't exist because we have no ability to talk about God. But, says the Christian, with respect, Professor Taylor, what if the infinite God decided to reveal God's self to the finite mind in a way that the finite mind could understand? That seems to me to be a logical possibility. In fact, for Christians, it's a central good news that this universal creator has chosen to reveal God's self to us in a way that the human mind can understand, by God becoming a human being, or as John would put it at the beginning of his gospel, the Word became flesh, a human being, and lived amongst us, full of grace and truth. So that by seeing the particular, we get a glimpse of the universal.
Great. Thank you, David. So here's the next question, okay?
These are great.
Returning to the Fermi paradox, with regards to your perspective on creation, could it be that humans aren't the only intelligent life in the universe, but maybe not even the first?
Yeah.
Could there be others, and we're like older siblings?
Yes, there could be, and I'm open to that, both as a scientist and a Christian. One of the issues in this we've got to be just a little careful about is there could be other intelligent life there, but we might not be able to see it. So, for instance, if there's an intelligent civilization in one of our neighbor galaxies, Andromeda, and they send a message to us saying, hello, is there anyone there in the Milky Way? That message would take about 2 million years to reach us. If we then send a message back saying, Yes, we're here. Who are you? That would take another 2 million years to go back. That's not a very interesting conversation, to be honest. But if you take that forward, it does mean that there may be civilizations there that are so far away that we might never know. The Fermi paradox only works for this galaxy. It wouldn't worry me at all if there were other intelligent beings elsewhere in the universe. For me, that would be a reflection of an extravagant God who creates. And the Old Testament particularly talks about the extravagance of the Creator God. Psalm 19 begins with, "The heavens declare the glory of God." Does that include other intelligent beings? It may do. The only way we can find out is by looking at the universe, exploring the universe, observing the universe. To find out what the universe is about, we have to do science, observation. God has given us that gift to do. I hope that answers the question in part.
Okay, I've been told that I can do 2 more questions. I mean,
Right,
I've got a whole pile,
I've
I'm
spoken
sorry.
far too long, forgive me.
So, what is your greatest challenge as, you openly speak about your faith in science?
Yes. The greatest challenge, I think, for me, is the problem that the world and we experience evil and suffering. If Christians, including myself, say that God is a good God, who is a loving God, then there is a fundamental problem, paradox, with our experience of suffering and evil. And the scale of that suffering and evil within the world. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that, Mark.
Yeah. Right.
I just don't think there's an easy answer. What holds me as a Christian is what I would do actually sometimes as a scientist. And you and I know that in any scientific model, there's always evidence for and evidence against. What you do as a scientist is you weigh the evidence for and against. The evidence that I see in Jesus of a good, loving God enables me to hold my unanswered questions about evil and suffering in the world. I think that's the greatest unanswered question for me. But it's not just an intellectual question. It's a personal question. When suffering or evil hits you, when you experience that in the lives of your friends. And those of you who are religious believers, if you pray and God doesn't seem to work, just as it was for Darwin with Annie, I think that's the greatest challenge.
Just a little bit of a follow-up for the last question is thoughts on how theology, religion can align with these scientific advancements that are coming, like genetic engineering,
Yes.
like super, intellectual property type, the consciousness argument for
Absolutely.
AI,
Absolutely.
all of these things. So just briefly.
Yeah, thank you. Our project in Durham, we work with Christian leaders. We also work with some of our leading scientists, many of whom are not people of faith themselves, but who want to engage with communities of faith and Christian theologians. And in part that's because some of the ethical questions and some of the questions about what it means to be human that we expose in artificial intelligence, in genetic engineering, are clear. They're there every day. And a number of these scientists will say to us, well, you Christians have 2,000 years of reflection on ethics and what it means to be human. Maybe you might be able to help us. Now, the key in that situation for me is that the Christian doesn't come in and say, okay, this is what you need to believe and this is what you need to do. For me, the good news of Jesus Christ is gift. I come to offer it to people, not to impose it on people. And the insights of Christianity for me are extremely helpful in understanding what it means to be human, in understanding some of the challenges that we have in the correct use of science, either for selfish gain or for justice and healing for all. I think Christianity makes a contribution to that. It doesn't tell people what they have to do. And so the sense of sitting around the table and talking about this together as a community seems to me very important. And I have to say that in my experience, scientists are more open to this than some of our church leaders. Some of our church leaders are wonderful, but many of our church leaders are a bit frightened about getting engaged in these conversations. I don't think they should be, not least because many of the folk in their congregations are working with these questions day by day as scientists, technologists, engineers. And if you're a scientist, technologist, or engineer tonight, or you teach science in high school, or you're studying science as a student, I want to say thank you to you. Thank you for what you do in exploring the universe and working with it. Because that for me is a God-given activity. And you're helping me. You could help me a bit more in answering some of the questions that I've been asked tonight. But keep on going, because I appreciate the work that you're doing. And I want to affirm it and say thank you to you for doing it.
Great. Thank you, David, for all of your insights tonight.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you for a most provocative evening. This is really quite wonderful to have you both here tonight. David is going to be out just outside the doors. They're selling books. He'll be there at a table so he can autograph them. Want to remind you to sign up to be on our mailing list. Again, that's at events.caltech.edu. And this has been a very special evening because we don't have calls and talks of this type very, very often on this campus. And so I'm very happy that all of you came to be part of it. And I particularly want to thank Professor Davis for bringing this to our attention and making it possible for us to have this evening. So thank you so much. And let's give them both a great big hand again. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. For those of you who were at in person or have watched the video for Beyond the Book series at Caltech with Reverend Dr. David Wilkinson, you will notice that we had many, many questions that we were not able to get to because we ran out of time. So David has graciously agreed to address those questions today. And with the help of his communication manager, Helen Billum, the way that questions have been organized are on various topics. I will read the individual questions per topic, and then she has created a summary question. David will then address the summary question. And that way we can at least list the questions and keep this session to a reasonable time. So with that, David, let's begin. The first topic is the universe and astrophysics. And the questions we have are, is it worthwhile to theorize about the multiverse if the technology to test multiverse theories is currently so far beyond our reach? Second question is, does Cantor's infinities allow for the possibility that the universe and God is vastly bigger than the multiverse? And you might want to mention what Cantor's infinities are. And the third question is, what causes the expansion of the universe to accelerate? So given those three questions, the summary question is, what is your understanding of how God works in relation to the multiverse theory? And is it worth theorizing on something we can't currently test?
The multiverse theory is fascinating and has fascinated physicists, particularly in the past few years. And it's a way, first of all, to try and understand the origin of the universe when it was at the quantum size. But also, it's a way to solve particular problems in quantum theory called the measurement problem. The possibility of multiverses, Mark, doesn't worry me. After all, the God of Christian creation is the God who has created 100 billion stars and 100 billion galaxies. A few more billion universes is not a deeply theological problem in addition to that. But there is a sense in which, as we think about infinities and just how big the universe is, the question exactly is God is God big enough to cope with this? And I think yes, because whatever the Bible says, one of the things it keeps stressing is that God is always greater than the universe, but connected to it. And Christian theologians have talked about this in terms of holding together the transcendence of God, God is more than, with the immanence of God. God is connected to the universe. Now, we'd need a much longer session than this to really try and figure out models of God that allow both transcendence and immanence. Or indeed, we could put it as God's infinite power and his specific actions in the world. I think one of the big questions, which the first question alludes to, is it worth thinking about multiverse when we have no currently observable way of checking on some of these theories? And that's because at the moment, we don't seem to have a mechanism to pass information from one universe to another. Now, that means for those of us who are mere scientists like you and me, if we want to know something in scientific terms, we need to have the data to show that it's there. We need to have an experiment to test whether that theory is good or not. At the moment, we don't have a mechanism, a technology, a possibility of detecting these other universes. So at the moment, for me, multiverse theory is philosophical speculation rather than physics. But there's nothing wrong in that. Philosophical speculation helps us to understand the metaphysics of existence. As long as we don't merge that multiverse at the moment is a scientific explanation of certain things in the universe, it remains very valuable speculation. And you and I, as scientists, we love speculation. We love thinking outside the box, and some of our speculations then lead us to conclude this is the way of finding out data. This is the way of checking this thing. So philosophical speculation stretches the imagination. Multiverse stretches the imagination. I don't think it's a theological problem for God. God's big enough even to cope with these infinities.
Great. Thanks, David. I think it's always fun to think outside the box.
It is, isn't it? And I mean, you in your own scientific career have done that a number of times. And that's one of the great gifts of scientists, the ability to speculate and think in ways that aren't already thought through.
Great. Thank you. Next topic is evidence for God. First question is, if fine-tuning isn't a very good argument because of the multiverse, is there in your mind a particularly helpful, rational argument for God? Or is experience or history a more helpful starting point? Second question, God might have created the universe, but how do we know that it is the God of the Bible? So the overall question then is, in your mind, is there a rational argument for the existence of God, or is it experience or history a more helpful starting point?
I think there are certain rational arguments which may point towards the existence of God. And the questioner has already raised one of them, and that is the possibility of our observation that the universe is just right, what Paul Davies calls the Goldilocks enigma, that the laws and circumstance of the universe are well balanced, just right, well fine-tuned to make possible self-conscious life like you and me. But for me, that's a pointer, not a proof. When we talk about rational argument, we sometimes get drawn into saying, is there a logical proof of something? And I don't think there is a logical proof of God. After all, we're using human logic here for a God who is beyond the universe, as we've just talked about. So I think there may be rational pointers towards the existence of God. Anthropic balances, the Goldilocks enigma, the fact that there are laws of physics which are universal. I think the fact that those laws of physics are intelligible to us. I think the experience of awe that we have when we look at the universe. All of those, for many people, and it's interesting that many scientists who wouldn't call themselves members of faith community see in those pointers towards perhaps a deeper story to the universe. But I agree with the questioner that in a sense, history and experience become extremely important in answering the question. Because going back to our first set of questions, if God is the infinite creator of the universe, how can our finite minds ever understand an infinite creator? But says the Christian, what if God decided to reveal God's self in a way that the finite mind could understand? Now, within the Christian tradition, God reveals in many and various ways, says the book of Hebrews, but supremely in Jesus, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And God also is a God of experience within the Christian tradition. So Christians say, in terms of understanding the evidence for God, first of all, we start with a God who speaks of God's self by becoming a human being within the universe, and then reaches out in love in some kind of experience. Now, lots of us have different experiences of God, so there's no one model in this. But it seems to me to be entirely reasonable to say that the only way we can know God is if God decides to share God's self with us, both in history and in experience. I mean, you and I have sat in many science classrooms, and there are some good teachers and there's some bad teachers in science classrooms. The really good teachers are the ones who are able to take their knowledge and present it in a way that's understandable to the mere undergraduates that you and I once were many years ago. The really bad teachers are the ones who can't articulate or explain in ways that are faithful to the knowledge, but in ways that are accessible. For me, the revelation of God is God communicating with us in a way that we can understand. And ultimately, the best way to understand, I think, is through incarnation, by becoming a human being. A friend of mine loved ants. His parents didn't like the ants at the bottom of his garden. And so one day he saw his mother filling the kettle with boiling water and started to march down the garden towards the ant hill. My friend, as a small child, went to the ant hill and tried to communicate to the ants and say, run, the boiling water is coming, you're going to be got in a moment. And he tried everything by waving his arms, and no communication happened. And eventually, reflecting on it as adult, he said, the only way that I could have really communicated with those ants is if I'd become an ant myself and communicated in a way that they could understand. So I think there are rational pointers towards a deeper story of God. They're not proofs, and I can't prove the existence of God to anyone. But the evidence for me is primarily in a God who becomes a human being and walks a space-time history of the universe.
Great. All right. The next topic is intelligent life off Earth,
Yes.
which you've thought a lot about. First question is, why would we need uniqueness to feel special? If there is other life out there, shouldn't we assume it is not only as loved by God as we are, but also that it doesn't take away anything from our relationship with him? He has enough love for all of us, after all. Second question is, if intelligent life is rare, is the universe mostly pointless? Does meaning require observers, or can meaning exist without minds? So the overall question then is, if life exists elsewhere in the universe, how does that impact our relationship with God? And if intelligent life is rare, is the universe mostly pointless?
Well, these are terrific questions, aren't they? And I think the questioners are often putting in their own questions a real insight, because I'd agree with the first question, and that is that I don't think we have to be unique to be special. Nicholas Cusa was a theologian of a few centuries ago, and Cusa said that we are special to God not because we're the center of everything, or because we are alone in the universe. And this was, by the way, many centuries ago that he was speculating on this. He said, we are special because of the gift of relationship. God has reached out to human beings and formed an intimate relationship with human beings. And that relationship gives us a sense of being special, but it's not exclusive. God could be in relationship with lots of other beings. And we know indeed that God values the physical creation, the very environment of our existence, plants, animals, not just human beings. Now, I think that's really interesting that here were Christians speculating about this many centuries ago. They had no problem with the possibility of other worlds. They said, God's free to create, therefore, who are we to say that we're the only ones in the universe? But we're special because of relationship. And therefore, my wife Alison is one of 4 children. The fact that she was special and valued by her parents doesn't mean that the other 3 siblings weren't special and valued to her parents. To be special and valued doesn't mean that we're the only, and that's always been an important part. Now, there have been Christians who've departed from that, and there have been Christians who've said, we're special because we're the only ones. I don't get that, Mark. I can't see that. Because God's love, as the questioner said, is big enough for all. Now, the second question is really interesting in terms of, if life is scarce, is the universe pointless? And in fact, that argument was turned on its head by some of the early astronomers, such as Christian Huygens and Richard Bentley. They were beginning to use telescopes to see just how vast the universe is. And Huygens and Bentley gave a theological argument which went like this. The universe is huge. It contains lots of stars and galaxies. We know in Psalm 19, verse 1, that the heavens declare the glory of God. So said Huygens and Bentley. If the glory of God is going to be fully seen, there have to be other life forms elsewhere in the universe, because we as humans are never going to see the whole universe. The sense of, I don't commend that theological argument to you. But it's interesting that, again, many centuries ago, Christians were doing this. But I think for me, the sense of even if we're alone in the universe, it doesn't mean that the universe is pointless. Great artists do things because they delight simply in creativity. Sometimes artists do things for their own enjoyment. They don't put things always on show in galleries because they love to create. Sometimes they share the beautiful creations that they do, but sometimes they just delight in creativity. Now, sometimes in the past, we've talked about the Creator God as a great mathematician. And I think that's right when you look at the laws of physics. But again, Mark, you and I know there are one or two very boring mathematicians in the world. We've met them from time to time. We're probably those ourselves. But God is also, as well as the great mathematician, the great artist who creates with extravagance. And there may be galaxies and black holes, Cepheids and huge quasars, which we may never see. But for me, that's part of the extravagant creativity of God, who delights to create. I mean, after all, in our own natural world, Mark, I'm a mere physicist. I've never understood why we have wasps. Now, a biologist will tell me why, but there's some extravagance in the natural world. We were taken very kindly in Pasadena to see the Huntington Gardens. And there we walked through cacti after cacti after cacti. I've never seen so many different cacti in one place. And you think to yourself, why isn't there just one? Now, part of it is the different conditions by which these different plants have evolved. But the natural world is full of extravagance. And I don't say that was a pointless walk through Huntington Gardens to see the cacti. I say, wow, isn't this an extravagant world?
Yeah, I agree with you a lot there, David, in the sense that when you think about an artist or a musician, creating their works, and even in science, that happens with us. In my own case, to be able to create something that never existed before, which we've done numerous times, the sheer joy of being able to do that, even though what you created, you have no idea whether it's going to be useless or whether, it will be useful to somebody. But just the
Well,
joy.
that's right. And there's a joy in it as well. And I was once asked this by a friend of mine. I was visiting, and it said, what's the point of the universe? Why did God create human beings? And on his knee was his 6-month-old new child. And I said, tell me, why have you had a baby? We live in a world where we no longer have babies because they're going to look after us in their old age. In fact, I don't trust in my children to look after me in my old age anymore. But there's a delight in creation. There's a delight in new things, new life. And I think your parallel with us as a scientist, as you create, you never quite know how things are going to be used, but you still take that delight in creation.
Yep. Thank you. All right. The next topic is other religions. So the first question is, why adhere to a Christian interpretation as opposed to, say, Hindu, Buddhism, Muslim, with respect to creation and functioning of the metaverse? Second question, similar, is what role do you believe other religions, such as Buddhism, Muslim, or even Taoism, play in explaining the universe or merging with science? Third question is, what makes Christian religion the is capitalized, way to connect with God? Isn't Christianity exclusive? And the final question is, what if someone is not a Christian and do not believe in Jesus? So the overall question here is, why adhere to a Christian interpretation of the universe over other religions and atheism?
I think these are really important questions because they point out how limited I am in responding to some of these questions. Now, I talk about the Christian faith because that's the perspective I come from. That's not to make any judgment on other faith communities. I need to be careful about speaking about other faith communities because they have their own texture and their own complexity and their own understanding, which often comes through living those faiths, which I've never done. I remember working in India with a good astrophysicist friend of mine and collaborator over many years. He was a devout Hindu. And he would say to me, I've been a Hindu all my life and I still don't fully understand everything about Hinduism. So, first of all, I need to be limited to speak about what I can speak about. And therefore, from my perspective, in terms of science and faith, I speak from a Christian faith. The second thing is that, however, having done that, I recognize, having spoken with people from different faith communities, that Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, what are called the Abrahamic faiths, have certain areas of agreement, partly because they're built on similar scriptural traditions. And in particular, the sense of a God who creates the universe freely, a God who's universal and faithful to the whole of the universe, and a God who has capacity to act in the universe is shared by these three faith traditions. When it comes to those Eastern traditions, I'm a little less confident about saying too much. But there have been authors who've pointed out that the sense of togetherness and interconnectedness of Eastern religions resonates a little bit with some of the insights from quantum theory of togetherness and separation. Now, I need to be careful not to speak too much about that because I don't know enough about it. But I don't think that Christianity's engagement with questions of faith is the only way that one can engage faith and science. And there will be other people from other faith communities who can do a good job at doing that. The sense, however, of the last two questions in this section is about whether Christianity offers exclusive answers or indeed exclusive access to God. And there, I think, again, Christians need to be careful about testifying to the God who we believe is revealed in Jesus, but that doesn't rule out insights from other faith traditions in terms of their experience of God or their understanding of the nature of the universe, or indeed, Mark, we would say their contribution to science, because we know that from China, within Islamic scientists, within Jewish scientists, there have been terrific contributions to the growth of science over the years. I think all I can point to is that I have encountered God in Jesus Christ. And I offer that as an insight, as a gift, not to say God can't work in other ways, but that the God that I've seen in Jesus has revealed God's self truthfully. And I offer that in, I hope, a degree of humility and grace to others.
Great. Thanks, David. If you may recall one of the sessions that we had with the students at Caltech when you were here,
Yes.
one of your messages to them was, it's okay to say I don't know. And
Yeah, absolutely.
I have to tell you that resonated quite a bit with the students.
Yes.
It's great to hear it again today.
Yes, thank you.
Next topic is science and ethics. So how does religion intersect with the modern world in scientific advancement such as AI and genetic engineering? How does ethics and morals and religion align with advancements in science? The second question then stems from one of the topics that I brought up when we were talking on stage, was the optimism brought by Star Trek.
Yes,
And so
absolutely.
the second question says, stemming from the Star Trek portion of the talk, does scientific theory have a responsibility to be optimistic? So the overall question now is, how do ethics and religious morals align with advances in science? Does science have a responsibility to be optimistic?
There's such a good area and a very contemporary area as we make progress in gene editing, artificial intelligence, as the questioner said. And one of the really interesting things, talking with scientists at the forefront of these areas, is they realize that the science itself raises questions which faith communities have been exploring for a number of years. Let me pick out a few of them. The first is how such technology can be used for the help or healing of the world. And that implies also a sense of justice for all, that these technologies shouldn't just be used for power, fame, and fortune, but for healing and for justice, particularly with reflecting God's concern for the poor. Therefore, I think questions when we come to AI of integrity, transparency, environmental care for the way that we want to build AI, a sense of not using it to oppress people or to even replace people in key jobs. Now, of course, AI will replace a lot of menial jobs, I'm sure, and I hope. And these are questions around human responsibility, of using the technology as servant rather than as master, and in looking to those who are most vulnerable in society. But I think there is a positive part to Christian ethics. Often people think that Christian ethics is about Christians saying no, 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 no. But for me, Christian ethics also says that science and technology, AI, gene editing, energy, these are gifts from God. Now, I think the language of gift means that you receive them with thankfulness, with joy, but you also realize that there is a responsibility to use them and to care for them wisely. And in any gift, there is risk. Now, Mark, I'm not a gardener in any way. The worst present anyone can bring me is a green pot plant, because I'm reputed for killing green plants inside the house by not looking after them properly. It's a risk to give me such a present, but I feel the responsibility. Now, when it comes to some of these science, forgive the silly illustration, but I think that our capacity to change the world for good in genetic advancements, in artificial intelligence, in engineering, are all gifts from God. One of the worst things I think we should be doing is burying our head in the sand and saying, these technologies are too risky, therefore I'm not going to have anything to do with them at all. This was the Luddite response, to say, it's far too risky, we're not going to have anything to do with this at all. And I think at that point, God may be saying to us in ethics, I've given you these opportunities to bring about healing for the world, to bring about good for the world, and you're not using them. So I think Christian ethics also comes with a responsibility to use these gifts and to take risks. Now, of course, they have to be mitigated risks. You have to do things wisely. And one of the great things about the scientific community, again, that you and I know, is that the scientific method done well is a method which takes community seriously. You work as part of scientific institutions. You submit papers to peer-reviewed journals. Your work is tested by your peers and fellow scientists. And part of that, and with government agencies coming in as well, mitigates risk. There's always risk in science. But I think the Christian says part of the responsibility that God gives us is risk, because God gives to human beings freedom. And therefore God risks by giving the gift of freedom.
Great. And if I may add, I think it's
Please.
very, very difficult to be a scientist if you're not optimistic, because
Oh,
you're
yes.
battling defeat all the time. And then, finally, when you get there, it's a pleasure to get there, but you have to be optimistic to succeed.
Mark, thank you for raising that. And that was part of the question. I got so tied up with the ethics that I forgot the Star Trek and the optimism, which is very important. And one of the interesting questions is, where does that optimism come from? Now, for me, part of that optimism is belief in a God who gives us the gift of science for good. And therefore, we have an optimism to understand the laws of physics, and we have an optimism to use the laws of physics for good. The fact that we can understand the laws of physics is, I think, because we're made in the image of God, that God is a God of creativity, and we're given that. Now, what's interesting about Star Trek is that sense of optimism for the future. And part of the biblical optimism for the future comes from the belief that the God who created the universe hasn't just gone off for a cup of coffee, not to have anything more to do with it. But this is a God who believes in the universe, is committed to the universe, and is about bringing new creation. So the Christian optimism is in a creator God who is still at work. And one might even say, providing opportunities for us to do good.
Great. All right. The next topic involves science and faith. First question is, empirical adequacy seems to show that from a phenomenological standpoint, science is not necessarily truth tracking. Does that help or hinder the faith and science dialogue?
No.
Second question, what is your scientific understanding of God? Third question, this is the question is from the person, not me personally. It says, I have wrestled with the tension that science cannot fully explain / validate the existence of God, but also knowing that God cares about the physical embodied world and is constantly trying to communicate with us and is a creator speaking through creation. How much can the study of our world through science really reveal about God, if at all? Is it simply admiration? So the overall question is, how much can the study of the world through science reveal about God, given that science is not necessarily truth tracking?
I think these are profound questions, and I think I might take a slightly different view to the first questioner and talk about the relationship of science and truth. Now, for me, I do agree that science doesn't give us the truth about everything. Scientific models are provisional. They are grasping reality, I hope in a tighter and tighter way, but they never tell me everything about everything. Now, sometimes philosophers use the word verisimilitude. Scientific models are very similar to reality, but they're not a complete description of reality. And therefore, we know that any model that we have of the universe is always provisional. It's always open to new data. And sometimes that data can cause a very different picture to emerge, what Thomas Kuhn called scientific revolutions. But actually, those big revolutions are few and far between. And even when you have an Einsteinian understanding of relativity, which revolutionizes the Newtonian laws of motion, Einstein still has to incorporate Newton into his bigger picture. So there's continuity. There's a tighter grasp of reality, I think. So I think there is truth within scientific models, but we always have to acknowledge that they're provisional. Now that links in, therefore, to any discussion around a scientific description of God. There have been some philosophers who've tried to take scientific models and lock them in to theological models so that they become a kind of philosophical integrated unity. The problem with that for me, Mark, is that these scientific models are provisional. They begin to change. So then what does that do to the theology? But at the same time, our theological descriptions of how God works in the world are also provisional. They're a bit messy than just an easy, naive, simple way of describing God and the world. And therefore, for me, the relationship between science and faith is more like what we're doing at the moment. It's not a philosophical unity, it's a conversation, it's a dialogue, where science asks certain questions about God's activity in the world, and theology in its understanding of God asks certain questions of science's understanding of the world. And often there's a conversation. Both of them have different backgrounds and interests, but in the conversation, there's often a messy overlap. Now, my experience is that the messy overlap is both joyful and frustrating. It's fruitful in that, as I've struggled with some of these questions, which your third questioner alluded to, those struggles have always been fruitful to both my excitement with faith and my excitement with science. I have sympathy with that third question about how does one understand God from creation? And I think it's not just admiration or awe-inspiring. I think it is that. Although, again, you and I know that most of science is not about awe-inspiring things. It's about the hard grind of doing the experiments, of getting the funding, of getting those research papers away, of experiments that don't work, of looking at the stars, hopefully through a telescope and finding it's cloudy that night, or finding that your data doesn't download properly and all the rest of it. That's the reality of science. But there are those moments that we've experienced where we go, gosh, wow, something where we say, isn't that amazing? We never expected that. Isn't that amazing? The world is simpler and more elegant than we ever imagined. That I can write down Maxwell's theory of electromagnetism in tensor form in an equation that is so small that I can fit it into the corner of a whiteboard. Now, those are moments where we just say, wow, gosh. And I think those are pointers for me towards God, but not proofs. The first professor of astronomy at Durham University, my own university, was appointed in 1842. His name was Temple Chevalier. And here in the university library, we had a series of lectures that he did called the Halcyon Lectures, which are given at Cambridge University. And Chevalier used these lectures. He had 20 lectures to give. The first 6 he used as astronomy to go, wow, gosh, isn't God amazing? Just look at how big the universe is. Look at the motion of the planets. Isn't this amazing? The next 6 lectures, he talks about how he knows about God through the Bible, the revealed religion. And then the rest of the lectures, he does what most of us do when we have to give a lecture series. And that is, he gets odd sermons and odd talks from various places and just pushes them in. But it's the first few lectures that are the most important. He says, I can see something of God through the universe by my astronomy. But if I want to know the nature of God in terms of a gracious, loving God, then I have to go to God's revelation in the Bible. And this is very important because many people have struggled with trying to prove God through the natural world. And the Scottish philosopher David Hume rightly said to Christians who were saying, isn't the world a bit like a wonderful watch? Isn't it beautiful? Hume said, I can't do the Scottish accent, by the way, Mark, but Hume would say, just hold on, you Christians, he would say. You're picking out all the nice examples from the world of beauty and awe. What about those moments of suffering and pain and hardship and injustice? He said, you can't prove God just by picking out the nice bits of creation. You've got to take the whole into account. And I think David Hume was right on that. And that's why for Christians, it's the God who is revealed in Jesus that becomes important, because our experience of the world is of a world that's both beautiful and broken. And the two always go together.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I know what you mean by things are always changing. And
Yes.
as we learn more and more, it's sometimes our original theories can be quite naive at the time. And so those people who have worked with me, one of the things I always joke with them about is nothing ruins a good story like data. And so you want to, do more and more experiments and so forth. But it's a point well taken that things progress and so forth.
Yeah.
Next topic is personal faith.
Yes.
The first question is, how in your own life have you experienced the presence of Jesus?
Yes.
Second question is, how would you advise someone in their own study of Scripture? What is the one thing you wish you knew sooner about engaging with Scripture? And the third and final question is, what are one or two most significant ways your astrophysics background has informed, persuaded, or reaffirmed your Christian faith?
Yes.
So the overall question for you then, David, is how in your own life have you experienced the presence of Jesus, and how does your astrophysics background inform your faith?
I came to faith as a teenager, and I'd had some kind of intellectual belief in God as a child, in the sense that I thought God probably existed, but had no real impact upon my life. He was a God who probably created the universe, but then stepped back and had nothing more to do with it. A number of things then happened for me. I saw something amongst Christians that was a different quality of life to what I saw elsewhere. I saw in the New Testament, as I began to read it for myself, and I'd never done that before, this man, Jesus, who captivated me. Now, there's much in the New Testament as I read it that I didn't understand. And much of it I still don't understand, Mark, if I'm truthful about this. But that central story of Jesus that I could not explain in any other way than that this was something quite extraordinary. This was the only reasonable explanation for me, was that this was God himself walking the pages of history in terms of what Jesus claimed about himself, how Jesus lived and demonstrated the kingdom of God, the significance of Jesus' death on the cross, and the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Now, that then gave me a certain amount of evidence, upon which I think then comes a moment of faith. And for me, faith is not believing those things you know aren't true, which is what some school children sometimes defined faith as. But faith is trust that leads to action on the basis of evidence. So when Jesus gives evidence of the kingdom, either in miracles or just in his teaching, it's always an invitation then to change lifestyle, to trust and to follow. There's action involved in it. And that for me happened at the age of 17. Very simple thing in the Methodist Church. A number of lay people, not great preachers, not clergy, came to our church and just told their Christian experience, their story over the weekend. And I remember a moment in a small Holy Communion service on the Sunday morning where this God, who I believed that I was beginning to see in Jesus, became experientially real. Now, Mark, if I was a great evangelist and a great communicator, the story would go off that I saw written in the stars, God loves you, or I was walking down the street and there was a blinding light, or I heard a voice saying this, that, or that. That never happened to me. But it was just a subjective feeling that God was present, God was real. Now, as I talk to Christian folk around the world, their experience of God is very different. It's fascinating that God seems to work in lots of different ways. For some people, it's very emotional. For other people, it's actually more considered and rational. But at the heart of Christian experience for me was this Jesus, who was both in history, but also in present experience in some way. Now, the questioner also asked how then that resonated with my astrophysics.
Right.
What is there in astrophysics? And let me pick out a couple of things. The first, and it's not very profound, I'm afraid, Mark, is just to reiterate that the universe is big. Now, you may be saying, why am I wasting this time talking to this chap from Durham and saying that the universe is big? That's not terribly profound, is it? Well, actually, it's a non-trivial fact just how big the universe is. It's 13.8 billion years old, roughly, give or take, plus or minus 0.1 billion years. But what's that amongst friends? J.B. Phillips, a Christian theologian just after the Second World War, wrote a little book in which the title was, Your God is Too Small. And so one of the things that astrophysics has often reminded me about is making God in my image. And Christian worship is full of songs about my Jesus, my Savior, as if in some way we own this God. My experience in astrophysics has always just blown that apart and reminded me that often my images of God are too small, that God is much greater than I can imagine. And therefore, I hope that gives me a degree of humility in my Christian walk. The second thing is the flip side of that, and that is a sense of the God who walks with me is a God who can do things, who holds the universe in the palm of his hand. And in the Old Testament, it's interesting when the people of Israel were in exile in Babylon, and they were struggling with a destruction of their country and a destruction of the temple, that Isaiah the prophet reminds them of the heavens, the glory of creation, in that part of Isaiah from chapter 40 onwards. And so Isaiah gives hope and comfort by reminding them of the Creator God who continues to be committed to the universe. Now, I see that in the sustaining of the laws of physics. And so that's always a reminder to me from astrophysics and gives me hope, something we were talking about earlier.
Great. All right. The next section is titled The Nature of God. And there's three questions here as well. Let's begin with one. Both to the atheist observer of religious practice and to the majority of Christian practitioners, the concept of God, for all practical purposes, appears to refer to a being, in quotes, rather than the mystic, in quotes, essence of being, a much more plausible, in my mind, belief. How would you address this to scientific non-believers? I.e., how do you conceive of the nature of God?
Yes.
Second question, does God have self-consciousness?
Yes.
And third question is, given that God is not a person, is God a condition that we call orderly? I can't even pronounce this word, orderliness of the cosmos and multiverse? Jesus called this condition love. So the overall question here is, how do you conceive of the nature of God? Is God a self-aware being or simply a description for the orderly nature of the universe?
These are profound questions, and they touch deeply on not just science, but Christian theology. Let me put my cards on the table on this one. I conceive of God as personal being. Conscious, yes. Self-conscious, yes. And I'll tell you why. It's not because of the pointers that I've talked about within the universe. If one talks about the intelligibility of the laws, the sense of awe, that subjective feeling, the universality of the laws of physics, these things I think you could explain by simply saying there is an orderliness to creation. And indeed, while we were at Caltech, we had the joy of staying in the Einstein suite at the Athenaeum. And Einstein, you remember, talked about science and religion. But for Einstein, the part that was divine there was nature with a big N. He believed in this orderliness throughout nature. I go further than that. And I do so not because of the science, but because of that Christian sense of revelation of God as person, focused in the person of Jesus, but very quickly joined within the experience of the early Christians by the experience of the Holy Spirit. Now, this is an extraordinary thing if you think about it, Mark, because Christianity emerged from Judaism. And Judaism believed in a personal God who acted in world history, in the Exodus, God the Creator. And fundamental to that was there was no other God but this God. Very quickly, the early Christians, who themselves came out of that Jewish heritage, began to talk about Jesus as God and their experience of God the Holy Spirit. That led them in the early church fathers to begin to try and understand God, the model of God, as the Trinity. Now, we haven't got 15 hours tonight to talk about the nature of the Trinity, but I'm fascinated that they were forced to this conclusion by their experience of God as personal in these ways. If you were creating a religion, Mark, don't put the Trinity in it. It's far too complicated. But just as sometimes the data for you and I as a scientist lead us to things that we wouldn't consider ourselves, but actually that nature, we follow the data, as you said. The data of the experience of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit led these early Christians to struggle with God as three in one. And theologians today continue to struggle with God as three in one, including myself, I have to say. But the great value of the Trinity in many ways is it gives us an understanding not just of a conscious God, but a loving God. Because the evidence that the New Testament presents is a God who, in three persons, is in divine relationship, dynamic relationship with himself. And so some people say to me, did God have to create the universe to experience love? Actually, the Christian says, no, God is already experiencing love in the three persons of the Trinity. God creates the universe because he wants to create. He doesn't need to create it. He does it freely and graciously. Now, that's a profound affirmation of the universe, of physics, of chemistry, and indeed of you and I, that God doesn't need to create. He wants to create. And so I think there is very helpful insights into seeing the universe having a deeper story of order and harmony, of the essence of being, as the questioner put it. But I think the Christian revelation goes further than that and says that this order within the universe, this sense of love within the universe, actually stems from a being who is ultimately personal. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that God is a person in the way that human beings are persons, but that God has a quality of ability to love and to share relationship with other persons. And that for me is God as personal.
Great. One final question, David.
Please, these are profound.
All right. So, how do you reconcile faith with the existence of human evolution?
Yes. Now, at this point, Mark, you'll understand that I'm a mere physicist. This is a question about biology, and you know far more about biology and medicine than I do on this. But let me defer to my friends who I've known over the years, who have been people of faith, but also biologists who understand evolution as the best model that we have to understand the emergence of the natural world. And what they'll do is, first of all, say that God can be a God of creative process as much as a God who simply creates by divine fiat there and then. And this is an understanding sometimes called theistic evolution, that God uses the process of evolution to bring about the huge, extravagant natural world in which we live. The question then, however, leads to one or two more difficult questions to tease out. The first that some Christians get worried about is how does this relate to the story in Genesis? And for me, the story in Genesis 1 is not a scientific textbook that I have to put down on one side of the page and biological evolution on the other side of the page and somehow figure out which is right or which is wrong. For me, the first chapter of Genesis is a theological text. It's answering different kinds of questions about the greatness of God and the goodness of God and the worship of God. They're complementary descriptions. The second issue that some Christians have is what then makes human beings special if I'm descended from common ancestors to apes? And for me, that's about actually what is special about us as human beings. Well, we know that it's not our genetic code too much, because I share 67% of my genetic code with cauliflower, which probably explains a lot about me. Is it about intelligence? Well, there's not an absolute distinction in terms of intelligence, because we know that many animals are intelligent themselves. Is it about my physical makeup? Well, not quite. the thing that the Bible says that makes us special is that relationship with God. So a friend of mine who is a distinguished geneticist, Sam Berry, used to say, maybe God used the physical process of evolution to bring about Homo sapiens. God then does something that God does throughout the Bible, and that is God takes initiative and gives the gift of relationship to the first men and women. At that point, you become man and woman in terms of a theological understanding. I warm to that a little bit. The third issue, however, I'm still struggling with, and that is that the evolutionary picture brings with it a lot of waste. And I used to work, one of the scientific problems I used to work on was the death of the dinosaurs, terrestrial mass extinctions, and whether they were all wiped out by a big comet 65 million years ago, and a number of terrestrial mass extinctions roughly every 30 million years in the terrestrial record. And a friend of mine who I worked on this, a distinguished astronomer himself, used to say, it's the amount of waste in the process that God has given us in evolution that worries me. Those branches of evolution that have gone nowhere, mass extinctions. Could God not have created a process much better, much more humane than the process of evolution? And Mark, in answer to that, I don't know. And let me say that again, because I really don't know. But the God that I see in Jesus is a God who ultimately is a good God who I trust in. And therefore, there are a number of these questions which I'm prepared to wait, talk to other Christians who are far better theologians than I, get insights from them, hear insights from scientific colleagues from other faith communities, and perhaps ultimately, on that day when I meet the Lord face to face, I've got a whole list of questions, longer than the questions we've talked about tonight. And I'm sure you'll turn to me on that moment and say, well, David, you got most of those answers wrong, didn't you, back when we talked? But there is an element in which I just have to hold a number of these questions. And I hold them because of the data that I've got. I might not have a full understanding, but I want to hold the data of science and the data of Jesus. And it's on that I trust, even if I have unanswered questions.
Great. Well, David, thank you so much for giving us your time to answer all these questions. It's great that you were willing to do that because we had such excitement in person there at Caltech, and it was a lot of people really did want to hear the answer to their questions. So really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Mark, thank you. It's always great to talk with you. And I'm just thrilled that people feel that they can ask these kind of questions and that we can at least try and say something in response. So thank you for this opportunity.